Please welcome Joshua McKenty, Head of Global Ecosystem Engineering at Pivotal.
Thank you. Really happy to be here. I put this talk together as a bit of a mixtape, which Bell and Sebastian have helped to organize the All Tomorrow's Parties events, and I was a child in the 80s, and I love this feeling that you get where you listen to all these different songs on a mixtape and you don't really understand how they're related to each other, but you get to the end and you kind of know what the story was about. And sometimes I feel that way about Cloud Foundry, like it is the mixtape of cloud-native software. And certainly our journey at Pivotal, working with large enterprises, has been a bit like that. They know when they start the tape that they're going on some kind of ride, and they're not really sure where they're going to get to, but they kind of commit themselves to that process. So I'm really excited to be at OpenDev today, and really I wanted to talk about something that happened recently that was a pretty big moment in the cloud-native community, really, which is that Microsoft joined the Cloud Foundry Foundation. And we've been involved, obviously, with Cloud Foundry since the very beginning at Pivotal, since we're a spin out of VMware where it was born. But Microsoft getting involved really is taking our relationship with them and our partnership with them to the next level. So I thought I would cover sort of how we think about openness at Pivotal and how we think about openness in our partnership with Microsoft, and the idea of open with security, right? So open is often conflated with just, well, anyone can do whatever they want, or we're all sort of socialists, and I'm Canadian, and this can go wrong in all these different ways. But what does open mean when it's a positive thing, without getting overly permissive? So in software, and particularly in IT, I think of open in terms of sort of three axes, right? What language am I allowed to use? As an enterprise developer, historically we were told, hey, you shall write in Java, or you shall write in .NET, or you shall write in COBOL, and that's all you get. And only having COBOL at your disposal is really limiting. And so a lot of what's happened in the last 10 years, but really particularly in the last 5, has been around this move towards polyglot, of the openness of languages. We can write now in Python, or in Node.js, or in Go, or in a mix of Java and .NET, and have those applications not really care, have the application architecture elevated above the language choice. And that's really important. The second idea of openness is really, where does my app run? I want to be able to run it on my laptop when I'm working on it. I want to be able to run it in a dev environment dedicated maybe to my team or my line of business. And I want to be able to run it in the public cloud of my choice, as well as in production data centers, possibly all over the world. So having freedom to run my application in different locations, regardless of where I built it, is really an important separation. And this last sense of openness is, what services can I use? And again, traditional large enterprise were pinned to maybe a single database or a single queue system. Thou shalt use the rack of databases in the basement. Thou shalt use the mainframe and the services that go along with it. And we've really grown beyond that now to say, hey, I want flavors of SQL and flavors of NoSQL. I want queue services. I want in-memory cache, and maybe it's Redis today and Gemfire tomorrow and Mongo and Cassandra and whatever service I want. I want to be able to bring my application to those services without thinking about, hey, if I'm running it in this place, what services do I have available to me? Decouple those things. So there's a challenge with this much openness, which is you can get lost in the details. You say, well, I sort of thought that SQL would work this way, and it did, except then I went to this other database, and those SQL functions didn't work. Or I was using this queue, and then I switched, and I was using the same technology. Why is it when I was using Redis on my laptop, it worked, and then when I started using Redis off in the cloud, it failed, right? So this principle, if you want to be formal about it, is called the principle of least astonishment. Things should work the way that the people who use them expect them to work. And I'm going to come back to this principle as we go, right? Developers are not a single class of human, right? This is not a uniform thing like saying fish. All fish are similar. Well, there are big fish and small fish. There are vegetarian fish. There are carnivorous fish. There are fish that don't even have fins. Developers are a bit like fish. So if you take that to its logical extreme, there are developers that love operating systems, right? Typically, they write operating systems. Maybe they work for Microsoft or they work for some Linux vendor. But large organizations don't want to pay developers to work on things they find fun. They want to pay developers to work on things that provide value, which is typically closer to the customer. We want to get as close to the pain that our users are experiencing as possible. And we do that by embracing opinions. So rather than using every possible operating system or every possible cloud, we're just going to not care. Or we're going to say, hey, we embrace certain services, where there are cases where we want to be opinionated and we care deeply, and there are cases where we want to be agnostic and care not at all. And so it's important to give developers a set of choices and not say everyone has to write at the same level of abstraction. You all have to write serverless from now on. So at Pivotal, we embrace what we call the 4 abstractions. We think about writing kind of serverless code where you're just caring about your function and you don't even care about the rest of the application. Or maybe a layer down from that, we're writing applications and we care about sets of services or microservices that talk to each other, but not where they run and the specific topology. Now, we do see use cases where even developers want to be at one level more detail, and they want to define the set of containers and where they'll be placed in relationship to each other, and we expose that as well. And then even one step further where you want to deal with virtual machines, key infrastructure, kind of define your own services that have persistent storage and complex lifecycle for state. So all 4 of those abstractions are really important. But, as I said before, developers are like fish. So if we want to keep our developers happy and they're not all unique and they're working towards different abstractions, we have to expose them different tools and different technologies. Let's start with Spring, right? We have a long history of working in the Java community, and we came up with this technology a few years ago called Spring Boot, which has now become wildly successful. I think the estimate is 85% of all new Java projects are started in Spring Boot. And it gives a very specific framework for building applications in Java. It's a set of opinions, if you like. If you're a Java developer and you don't want to think about the details of, well, how do I want to concatenate 2 strings? Great. Spring's got a way to do that. It's got a way to deal with having different services in your application talk to each other. It's got a way to deal with scaling out and load balancing and service discovery. And it makes a set of opinionated choices. You don't have to use Spring, but it's one of the ways we address that. And the sense of openness is, if you want this language, here's a framework. We're now working together with other partners in this ecosystem, including Microsoft, to make these same approaches work well in .NET. So you can have your best of class .NET applications also be open source, also be taking advantage of microservices, and still run them anywhere. Let's talk about opinions one layer deeper. Let's talk about that abstraction of infrastructure. So Bosch has always been a part of Pivotal's technology stack. We think of it as sort of the secret sauce behind Cloud Foundry. And it is sort of if you think of what we all used to do years ago with Bash scripting or Perl scripting or Python or whatever to orchestrate infrastructure, right? Puppet, Chef, Ansible, Salt, Juju. That's the opposite of Bosch. It solves the same problem, works the opposite way. So it really says, here is a set of steps, run this script, get to some state. Bosch says, ignore the steps, define the state you want, and I will figure out how to get you there and keep you there forever. So these are state transitions. This is what I like to call a narrow AI for deterministic infrastructure. So this is our opinion, and this is how we say, hey, whatever Bosch is running above could be Microsoft Azure, could be another public cloud, could be a private cloud powered by OpenStack, powered by vSphere. Bosch doesn't care. It's going to get your system into a desired state and keep it there. Now, that doesn't mean you don't care about the services provided by those underlying infrastructures, and that takes us to this last piece, Open Service Broker API. This was started originally by Pivotal and turned into an open source, open community project now embraced by the Kubernetes community, by Google, by other partners. And it really says, hey, here's a standard way of connecting applications to services, connecting the stateless world to the stateful world. The cool thing about this is it still embraces all 3 of those opens. It embraces any language, any location, any service. And this is kind of a crazy picture, but I wanted to sort of spell this out. You've got some app running in Cloud Foundry somewhere. It actually doesn't have to be running in Cloud Foundry. It could be running in Kubernetes. And it wants to bind to, let's say, a Redis cache. Well, that could just be running as a sort of platform service operated by somebody as a Redis endpoint. Could be operated by Azure. So you've got Azure Redis. It could be spun up as a VM and brokered by Bosch for you on demand. It could be a single tenant or multi-tenant. It could be, the app doesn't have to care. And that's really the important abstraction we're saying is principle of least astonishment. Your developer wants to say, hey, my app needs Redis. If my app is running in dev, it should be using just Redis on my laptop. If it's running in this pre-prod environment, it should be using the Redis provided in a VM next to it. If it's off in production, it should be using Azure Redis. That separation of binding and brokering is so critical to providing that kind of freedom. Now, I've been talking a lot about the open side of this, but I want to emphasize the other side of the coin, right, which is security. And I'm going to bring a customer up for a second here, a little fireside chat to talk about why staying secure while being open is so important. But I wanted to make a Monty Python reference because that's sort of what I do. So when I think of security, I kind of think of castles and moats, right? And what was the secret to the castle and the moat in Monty Python? Does anyone remember? It's like, we've already got one! The secret was multi-tenancy. They don't have to share their Holy Grail. Like, we don't need to go with you to go find your Holy Grail. We have our own Holy Grail. And in fact, everyone's got their own Holy Grail in this movie, even though you never get to see it. It's perfectly secure. All joking aside, the hard part about security in an open world is usually addressed best by just fixing the multi-tenancy model. Say, look, if this data service does not protect users well from each other, just run multiple copies of it. Yeah, I don't want to share Redis with you. Sorry, like, we're friends, but we're not that good friends. I'll have my own Redis. You have your own Redis. That seems just fine, right? The technical term for this, and I think it was Snap came up with this. I should double check that. Is a limited blast radius, right? Things are going to go wrong. They're going to go wrong in prod. They're going to go wrong in pre-prod. They're going to go wrong every day somewhere in the world. And maybe it's a failure, and maybe it's a security compromise. The best position you can have is that the blast radius of that failure is really small, almost infinitesimal, and that there's other key infrastructure that can step in and take up the slack and say, okay, well, that Redis instance is gone. Do we care? Not really. It'll be back in 60 seconds or so, and in the meantime, there's other Redis instances and other versions of the app running elsewhere. So that separation of tenancy from configuration is really an important part of this architecture. And I'm just talking about architecture here. I'm not really talking about individual projects. All right, I went over a bunch of technologies, and I talked a little bit about architecture, and I talked a little bit about open source, but what I skipped was, how do you make decisions? This all starts feeling really complicated. I have all of these choices. Any language I want, any location I want, any service I want. How do I pick? And since all of this is open source, how do I pick which things I build for myself, which things I just download from GitHub, and which things I actually buy and get real support for? Parker Thompson used to work at Pivotal, and this was kind of his framework, is to say, well, you should really have the wisdom to know the difference. That's funny, but not very helpful as a piece of advice. So I was inclined to go back to an old colleague of mine, Clayton Stark. And this is not, obviously, he didn't say this. Deming said this first. But in God we trust, all others bring data, right? Use the data, Luke. The data tells you when you should be building something yourself. And typically, that's when it's as close to your customers as possible, right? You don't want to be the best in the world at what you do. You want to be the only one in the world at what you do. So if you're in the business of building distributed systems, you should be in a distributed system software company. You should probably come work for us. If you're in the business of building video games, you should go and build video games, which is what Clayton does, right? He does not build his own distributed system. And if you're in the business of dealing with, you know, millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions, I have no idea how many transactions a day of real valuable financial information, you should probably go work for MasterCard, which is what my good friend Rick Clark did recently. Rick, can you come up here? Let's have a bit of a chat. So, Yeah, let's take a seat. I'm actually going to grab my water. I don't know if you brought yours.
I did not.
All right, well, I haven't opened that one, so there you go.
Thank you. Oh, here, you can have it. I'm fine.
Oh, thank you. Oh, there you go. All right. So just for context, I introduced you, you're the SVP at MasterCard. I think you own everything related to cloud, right? Which is a...
Digital transformation, I'd say. Cloud is part of it.
Okay, very much. But I think I got to know you when we were both involved in OpenStack back in the very early days. So maybe we could start with this transition. MasterCard involved in open source. Is that new? Is that a real thing? How do you think about that?
Well, it's not new. I mean, I've only been there 6 months, and it predated me.
Okay. So it's at least 6 months old.
It's at least 6 months old. But we have active contributors to Apache, so we actively use open source. Mm-hmm. I think now it's becoming a larger part of the choice when we're making decisions. It's a bigger and bigger criteria, and it's not just a checkbox. Mm-hmm. You know, the way open source is done matters to us too.
Right. So with that as a backdrop, why did you pick Cloud Foundry? What was the thinking there to say, hey, this could be good for MasterCard?
Well, there are many, many reasons, which we don't have time to go into. Sure. But so the primary reason is that the abstraction layer works for us. That when you're going through digital transformation, there are a bunch of things that have to happen. One of which is you have to retrain all the people working on brownfield to eventually work on the new greenfield stuff. And the abstraction layer provided by Cloud Foundry gives us the breathing room as we start moving applications so that we can do that. Mm-hmm. So we can start increasing the knowledge of our staff so that we can start working on other things. Right. And then sort of move down the stack on the different abstraction layers.
Right. I'm a parent, and I always tell my daughters, you can do anything, but not everything. And I sort of feel like that's true for your team when you're going into, any sort of transformation. You can learn to do anything. You can't learn to do everything. So you've got to pick those abstractions.
Well, and starting with something that you can actually do. So I've seen a lot of companies that start with we're going to build our own platform. And they've never done anything in the cloud before. This is their first thing, so they're going to do the most complicated thing possible because they know best.
Right.
So we didn't start that way.
So there's obviously a lot of players in the public cloud, and they've all been courting all Cloud Foundry users. In fact, all of the Fortune 500. What is it about Azure that's exciting to you?
Well, I would say that. I know this isn't their slogan, but it's kind of cloud for grown-ups, right? So we're at MasterCard. We're a big company, and this is our first foray into cloud. Yeah. And we needed someone that could provide us the support that we needed, and that was building something that was more tailored for us. Right. So they've done a lot of hand-holding. They were there when we needed them, and so the support, I'd say, is just number one.
It's interesting. So Azure is cloud for grown-ups, and Pivotal gives you breathing room while you change. This makes sense. I guess the Cloud Foundry has a number of vendors. I would love to know, other than the fact that I'm awesome personally, what was it about Pivotal as a Cloud Foundry vendor that was?
It was all you and James Waters. Yeah. This is new to us, right? We're new to cloud, and we want to go with someone that has done this many, many times. Mm-hmm. Let's rely on the experience of others rather than iteratively failing ourselves many times, or going with someone that we're not quite sure about. So we knew we needed help to deploy it correctly, and we went with the people that had the most experience.
Totally.
There's really not much to think about for us.
Right. I do want to talk briefly about OpenStack, but really in the context of, a lot of what I'm emphasizing here is these buy versus build decisions, right? Like you can download things from GitHub and run them, or you can figure out how to build a team and assemble stuff yourself. You could say, hey, we are going to go build our own platform. And we saw a lot of people do that with OpenStack, right, for a depressing number of years. How do you think there's a general principle for these sorts of decisions when you're talking to your peers, executives at other financial companies? Do you say, hey, here's how you think about what do you buy and what do you build?
I do.
Tell me, what is it?
So I think that everything that you build, developers are a precious resource in your organization, right? Every line of code that you write should benefit your customers or shareholders. So you shouldn't be writing things that don't benefit them. And if you go back to that, it makes the decision easier. Also, I like to ask two questions. Is should we before can we? So should we do this?
Right.
Developers will want to do a lot because everyone thinks I can do this 10% better. But should we?
Right.
Even if you can, should we? So I ask that question a lot to both my team at MasterCard, and I discuss that with other people in the industry.
Right, right. There's a lot of false attribution error in the developer mindset, I think, which is like, well, other people have written bad code because they're bad people. I write bad code because it's technical debt and I was under pressure. Right? And so when we imagine writing code in the future, we imagine it's going to be flawless and therefore better than everyone else's code. And so there's a lot of like accidental hubris in these buy versus build decisions. And I think open source communities are a fun way to kind of watch that play out. But let's look at the Cloud Foundry Foundation for a second. What signal do you think it sends to have Microsoft joining the foundation so publicly?
Well, I think it sends a very strong signal to us because we consider both Microsoft and Cloud Foundry to be important partners for us moving forward. Yeah. So the huge buy-in to the foundation, which is extremely important and a big part of our decision to go with Cloud Foundry, is, I mean, that gives us some confidence and security.
You also mentioned there's, it's not just that it's open source, but how is it open source and how is it built that is more and more a factor. And we see that across our whole customer base. Do you want to elaborate on that a bit? What is it about the community that's important to you and to MasterCard?
Well, it's that it can be collaborative and you can participate in the roadmap. So if there are open source projects out there that are really just code escrow, right? I mean, as you and I both know from before the days of OpenStack, there were cloud projects out there that didn't allow you to contribute patches. And if I can't fix patches, if I can't influence the direction, then it's just like closed source to me.
Right.
So having not only the ability to submit my patches and influence direction, but a foundation that is separate from any one company is an important thing. And I would say that if I'm looking at any project, that I'm going to go for the one in the foundation before I go for one that's not, regardless of the project in the company.
When we think about what happened with OpenStack, for sure, was this notion of, hey, private cloud, public cloud is still important, and what does hybrid look like in the future? And now we see Azure Stack on the horizon. And we see, certainly on the container side, things like OCI and Run C and even Kubernetes, which Pivotal has adopted with Kubo and directly with Run C. Are you thinking carefully about the kind of hybrid story, what goes into public cloud, what goes into private, how do we mix those? Or is it still a question of preserving optionality, right, and be able to move it later?
Well, so for us, it's about preserving optionality, but that's because regulatory requirements are going to drive that for us. Right. If I were at a different company where I didn't have regulatory requirements or I could only be in one country, I would just choose public, personally.
Right. Yeah, we see only a small number of Pivotal's customers, and because we, again, deal basically with the Fortune 500, most of them have some kind of hybrid story. What about myths? I feel like open source 20 years ago, 30 years ago was simple because there was so little going on. And now it's beyond the point of so much going on that everyone's confused. And now it's even more than that and people believe there's simple patterns, right? They believe. So are there cases where you say, well, I had a vendor come to me and say X and they thought it was really important and it's not a thing I even really care about?
Yeah, I would say that we have a lot of misinformation that comes.
in terms of the fake news, hashtag fake news in open source?
Yeah, and some of it comes from one open source vendor about another.
Right.
And I don't want to call out vendors,
Sure.
but there's been quite a bit. And I've worked hard to make sure that we get outside information to make sure that we don't fall for those sorts of myths.
Right. It's interesting. I think it's easiest in open source to see the personalities at work, and to see the way that the sort of culture of the community forms around the early contributors. Right? And so that notion, to your point of like, if it's just code escrow, if it's just a way to be public about your source code but not actually be collaborative, it doesn't really help anyone. Right? The other fake news thing I see, or I guess the question I would have is, what about standards? Because it used to be everything was about the standards body, the RFCs and the DMTF and the whatever. But now it seems like the emergent, where the community consensus is the standard.
Yeah, the market sort of defines the standard rather than chasing it. So I firmly believe that the standards bodies, especially, and there are many. You probably know this, but many of the large vendors are involved in standard organizations just to slow them down. So they tend to lag while people try to get their products, the companies try to get their products right. So whatever is out there and works ends up becoming the standard.
Right. Just let me take this one step even weirder, right? So you're saying, look, we work with the open source community because we can collaborate, we can influence the roadmap, we know that over time it's going to be more and more exactly what we need. And then you think about, okay, also we're working in a competitive world where we have other companies that want to get close to us in our market, and I think in particular in the fintech startup space. Do you make decisions inside MasterCard now on, hey, these things we're going to do in the open and these things we're going to just keep to ourselves because we think they're a competitive differentiator, or is the goal always to out-execute and go faster? And is it open first as a policy?
I don't know if it's open first as a policy. I think that there are reasons in our industry to not do that, separate from competition. That there's a huge volume of financial information that flows across our network. So I think we are open when it's best, and not open when it's best.
Right. Yeah. Sam Ramji, when he was running the Cloud Foundry Foundation, was famous for having coined this idea of Cloud Foundry as a place of practice, right? And I think he was taking it in terms of sort of a Buddhist framing of practice, but I actually like the idea of deliberate iteration as kind of the hallmark of a healthy open source community. But something that a really healthy community does well is define when is it ready for use and when is it still experimental. And I guess something we've been trying to be very deliberate about in the Cloud Foundry community is say, hey, every sub-project releases whenever they want, which is sometimes every day, sometimes every week, but Cloud Foundry, Pivotal Cloud Foundry overall is released every quarter on a steady cadence, and then once a month as a dot release. We're trying to find that sweet spot between the rapid, agile delivery of an open source community and what any big enterprise can rationally consume, right? Because CD is amazing. You don't want to CD everything every day, right? I don't want to go up to the terminal, point of sale terminal with my MasterCard and go to pay a bill and have all the buttons in a different place every day. I'd be like, how do I tip? Oh, I guess the tip options today are in Greek numerals or something, Where do you see that? Where do you see that sweet spot between like go fast and go slow, or go fast and be safe?
So I guess it depends on where you are, so in the stack, your technology. So the way I like to think of things is that you release quickly with versioned services, and then you let your customers decide when they accept them.
Right.
So that's kind of my view of things, and hopefully everything works.
So what you've just said there, I think that's this key idea is that you have customers, that the internal service has customers, and therefore you have your product, each service is a product, the larger application is a product that has those as vendors, and then you have your eventual end user customer. Do you think product management thinking is actually common yet? Because I guess what we see in digital transformation is it's the hardest thing to go teach companies is to have a product mindset and say, oh, I guess this is a product, not just an internal service. It's a real world thing. How do you foster that? Are you just hiring a lot of people?
Well, some of it comes from, culture comes from the top.
Yeah.
So, I think we have at MasterCard have fostered that kind of culture, and that's how we look at things. Any internal service we build, it's going to be a product, and we're going to treat the users like customers,
Right?
like we should.
Right.
Yeah.
On the public cloud landscape, right? You mentioned, rationally, if you were a small startup, you'd probably just go all in on public cloud. Would you go all in on a single vendor, or would you still look for multiple vendors? And how do you think about that?
So it depends. It depends on where I need to be. If you look at someone like Netflix, that single vendors work for them. I think that no matter who you are, I think I can guarantee the resiliency of any public cloud provider is better than your resiliency now. So all of this, all of the mental anguish about it's really just fake.
Right.
It's just they're already better than you.
Right.
So you could just pick one and go with one.
Yeah.
Now they're not all in all the same places. So there's some ease once you get used to writing to the services of one. So if I only needed to be in the U.S.,
Right.
I would probably go with one cloud provider and stay with them and develop a good partnership with them.
Right.
Because I'm not really worried about any cloud going down.
Right.
I'm not worried about it.
Yeah. I still see, differentiation, kind of pretty interesting tech differentiation in the focus and the talent. And, when you think about a company like Microsoft with tens of thousands of developers who've worked for decades on things like SQL Server, they know SQL really well. And you obviously worked on SQL technologies back in the day. How would you counsel other enterprises, other ones of Pivotal's customers for when you make those decisions of saying, just let your developers use whatever they want, or give them a pick list, or?
I don't think you can let them use whatever they want. That'd be great. It'd be great if you could, but that ends up being unmanageable. Yeah. And there's no governance around it.
Right.
So you have to be able to, those developers, if everyone does whatever they want, when one of them gets hit by a bus, then you're just out of luck. Yeah. So things have to be done with some sort of governance so that someone else can pick up.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't just say, take out your credit card, use whatever technologies you want. I think that would probably be a mistake.
Yeah. Yeah. The first day of I Built It is the easy part. It's day 2 and day 7 and day 400. It's like, I need to patch it, and it's already a legacy. Every greenfield system turns into legacy eventually if it doesn't die. So, last thoughts, parting thoughts on these themes of like enterprise decisions around open source and around the way that old vendors are reinventing themselves, new foundations, new technologies.
So I will say just about build versus buy. If you're not sure, don't build it. So that's if there's any doubt, then you're making the wrong decision.
Yeah. There was ambiguity in your previous of like, should I and can I? But now you're like, if you're not sure, don't.
But so what I didn't say is that the answer to should I is almost always no. Right. Unless it's the thing that you do, unless it's what your company does. What Pivotal does is make a platform, a cloud platform. Yeah. So you should do that.
Yes.
That's not what MasterCard does.
Right.
We should do the things we're good at.
Right. Yeah. It's also why we don't do billing systems at all. It's like we have not tried, but should not try.
Other people would try. Somewhere there's a startup saying, you know what, none of these billing systems work for us, let's build our own. But it's really complicated.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason they're hard to build is because there's a lot of details that are not obvious. And actually that abstraction thing, if you do a really good job of delivering the abstraction, people will assume your software is trivial because using it should be trivial, right? But actually what it's doing behind is not. So, yeah, very cool. Hey, I really appreciate you coming out for this. It's been fantastic to have you here.
Anytime, Josh.
Awesome. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks.